On a quiet morning in 1927, a muddy airfield outside New York was filled with reporters, mechanics, and curious spectators. No one knew they were about to witness the beginning of one of the most extraordinary moments in aviation history. A young pilot climbed into a small aircraft that looked far too simple for the journey ahead. There were no co-pilots, no advanced instruments, and no guarantee he would ever return. Yet within hours, this lone aviator would begin a flight that would shock America, and soon, the entire world. His name was Charles Lindbergh. Before we continue this incredible story, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join our community of history lovers. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Because the story you're about to hear is one of courage, risk, and a moment that changed aviation forever. In the early 1920s, aviation was still young and dangerous. Airplanes were fragile machines made mostly of wood, metal frames, and stretched fabric. Engines could fail without warning. Navigation tools were basic, and long-distance flights were considered extremely risky. Crossing the Atlantic Ocean by airplane seemed almost impossible. Ships had traveled between North America and Europe for decades, but aircraft simply didn't have the range or reliability for such a journey. Still, the dream fascinated pilots around the world. In 1919, a New York hotel owner named Raymond Orteig made a bold announcement. He offered a $25,000 prize to the first pilot who could fly non-stop between New York and Paris. It was called the Orteig Prize, and it quickly became one of the most famous challenges in aviation. For years, experienced pilots attempted to prepare for the flight. Some had powerful aircraft and large teams supporting them. Others worked with major aviation companies that could design advanced airplanes. But despite the excitement, the challenge remained unfinished. The Atlantic Ocean was simply too vast and unpredictable. Then a quiet young pilot from America began to study the problem differently. Charles Lindbergh believed that success didn't depend on having the biggest aircraft or the largest team. Instead, he believed in something simpler: efficiency. He proposed building a lightweight airplane that could carry enough fuel to cross the ocean without stopping. The aircraft would be simple, strong, and designed for one purpose: endurance. With financial support from a group of businessmen in St. Louis, Lindbergh worked with engineers to build the airplane that would soon become legendary. It was called the Spirit of St. Louis. The aircraft looked unusual. To carry enough fuel for the journey, a massive fuel tank was placed directly in front of the cockpit. This meant Lindbergh couldn't see forward through a traditional windshield. Instead, he relied on side windows and a small periscope to check his direction. Many aviation experts were skeptical. Flying alone across the Atlantic meant facing storms, exhaustion, darkness, and mechanical risks without any support. If something went wrong, there would be nowhere to land, only miles of open ocean below. But Lindbergh was determined. On May 20, 1927, the Spirit of St. Louis was rolled onto the runway at Roosevelt Field in New York. The aircraft was extremely heavy with fuel, so heavy that some observers feared it might not lift off at all. The engine roared as Lindbergh pushed the throttle forward. The plane rolled across the muddy runway, bouncing over uneven ground. The end of the field was approaching quickly. For a moment, it seemed as if the aircraft might run out of space before it could take off. Then slowly, just before the edge of the field, the wheels lifted from the ground. The Spirit of St. Louis was airborne. Lindbergh turned east, pointing the small aircraft toward the vast Atlantic Ocean. Ahead of him were more than 3,600 miles of water, clouds, and uncertainty. Behind him, America watched and waited. Newspapers began reporting the daring attempt, and people across the country followed the story with growing excitement. But no one knew if the young pilot would actually reach Europe. For more than 33 hours, Lindbergh would remain alone in the cockpit. No sleep, no autopilot, only determination. As night fell over the Atlantic, the small aircraft continued east through darkness and cold winds. Far away in Europe, crowds slowly began gathering at Le Bourget Airport near Paris. Rumors were spreading. An American pilot might actually be coming. And if the reports were true, the world was about to witness a moment that would shock millions. Because when Lindbergh finally appeared in the skies above Paris, something incredible would happen. Something that would unfold in just 8 unforgettable minutes. For hours, the small aircraft continued, east across the vast Atlantic Ocean. Inside the cockpit, Charles Lindbergh remained completely alone. There was no radio to communicate with the ground, no advanced navigation systems guiding his path, only a compass, simple instruments, and the endless stretch of ocean below. The engine of the Spirit of St. Louis roared constantly, vibrating through the thin metal frame of the aircraft. Every sound mattered. Every movement of the engine could signal danger. Lindbergh listened carefully to the rhythm of the motor, because if the engine stopped, there would be no second chance. Hours passed slowly. During the early part of the journey, clouds covered much of the sky. Sometimes Lindbergh had to descend through thick mist just to see the ocean below and confirm his direction. At other times, he climbed above the clouds where the sky was clearer, but the air was colder. The temperature inside the cockpit dropped steadily. Frost began forming on the windows. But the greatest challenge was not the cold. It was exhaustion. Before the flight, Lindbergh had already been awake for many hours preparing the aircraft and waiting for weather conditions to improve. By the time the airplane reached the middle of the Atlantic, fatigue began to press heavily on his mind. His eyes struggled to stay open. At times he felt as if he might drift into sleep for just a few seconds, and that could have been enough to lose control of the aircraft. To stay awake, Lindbergh opened the side window and allowed freezing air to rush into the cockpit. The sharp cold helped keep his mind alert. Still, the long hours tested his endurance. At one point, strange shadows seemed to move across the cockpit. Lindbergh later described moments when his tired mind imagined shapes and voices that were not really there. Fatigue can play powerful tricks on the human brain, but the young aviator forced himself to stay focused. The aircraft continued forward, hour after hour. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic in Europe, news of the daring flight had begun spreading rapidly. Reports suggested that an American pilot had left New York and might be heading directly toward Paris. Newspapers rushed to publish updates. People gathered around radios and bulletin boards waiting for confirmation. By the time Lindbergh was approaching the European coastline, excitement had reached extraordinary levels. In France, thousands of people began traveling toward Le Bourget Airport, the airfield outside Paris where the flight was expected to end. At first, the crowd was small, but as the hours passed and more reports arrived, the number of people continued to grow. Hundreds turned into thousands, then thousands turned into tens of thousands. Many of them had never seen a long-distance airplane flight before. The idea that a single pilot could cross the entire Atlantic Ocean without stopping seemed almost unbelievable. Yet the rumors refused to disappear. As evening approached in Paris on May 21, 1927, the crowd had become enormous. Cars lined the roads leading to the airport. People climbed onto rooftops, fences, and even trees to get a better view of the runway. No one knew exactly when the aircraft would arrive, but everyone hoped they would witness history. Meanwhile, high above the English Channel, Lindbergh finally saw something he had been searching for since the beginning of the journey. Land. After more than 30 hours over open ocean, the sight of the European coastline was a powerful relief. The young pilot adjusted his course and continued toward France. Villages, rivers, and fields slowly appeared beneath the wings of the aircraft. The journey was almost over. But Lindbergh had no idea what was waiting for him in Paris. As darkness began to fall over the city, the crowd at Le Bourget Airport had grown to an estimated 150,000 people. Searchlights scanned the sky. Police struggled to control the massive gathering. Everyone looked upward, hoping to see the small aircraft that had captured the imagination of the world. Then suddenly, a distant sound echoed through the night air. An airplane engine. People pointed toward the sky. A tiny shape appeared against the darkness, approaching slowly over the lights of Paris. In that moment, the crowd realized something incredible. The American pilot had done it. The aircraft circled the field once, preparing to land. What happened next would shock everyone watching. Because in just 8 minutes, the arrival of one exhausted aviator would transform him into one of the most famous men on Earth. The small aircraft circled slowly above the glowing lights of Paris. Inside the cockpit, Charles Lindbergh was nearing the end of a journey that had pushed both man and machine to their limits. Below him, the scene was unlike anything he had ever seen. The runway at Le Bourget Airport was surrounded by a massive crowd. Searchlights swept across the dark sky, and thousands of people were packed together as far as the eye could see. Lindbergh had expected a few officials and perhaps some reporters waiting for his arrival. Instead, nearly 150,000 people had gathered. As the Spirit of St. Louis descended toward the runway, the crowd began to surge forward. People waved their hats, shouted excitedly, and pointed at the aircraft moving slowly through the night sky. For many in the crowd, this moment felt almost unbelievable. For years, crossing the Atlantic Ocean by airplane had seemed like a distant dream. Many experienced aviators had tried and failed. Some had even lost their lives attempting the journey. Yet now, a single young pilot had completed the impossible. After more than 33 hours in the air, Lindbergh guided the aircraft toward the runway. The wheels touched the ground smoothly. For a brief moment, everything seemed calm. Then the crowd exploded with excitement. Thousands of people rushed toward the airplane at once. Police officers struggled to hold them back, but the excitement was overwhelming. People broke through barriers and flooded the runway, surrounding the small aircraft within seconds. Lindbergh had barely shut off the engine when the crowd lifted him from the cockpit. The exhausted pilot, who had not slept for nearly 2 days, suddenly found himself carried through a sea of cheering people. Cameras flashed everywhere. Reporters shouted questions. Some members of the crowd tried to grab pieces of the airplane as souvenirs, pulling small bits of fabric from the wings of the Spirit of St. Louis. Others simply wanted to shake the pilot's hand. It was chaos, but joyful chaos. For 8 unforgettable minutes, the crowd celebrated wildly as the news spread across Paris and soon across the world. The unknown aviator from America had just become an international hero. Officials quickly realized the situation was becoming too crowded and potentially dangerous. French authorities moved Lindbergh away from the aircraft and escorted him to safety inside a nearby building. Even there, the excitement did not stop. Reporters filled the room with questions about the historic flight. They wanted to know about the journey, the dangers, and how he had managed to stay awake for so long. Lindbergh answered calmly, despite his exhaustion. He explained how he had navigated using simple instruments, how he had fought fatigue during the long night over the ocean, and how the aircraft had performed exactly as he had hoped. Outside the building, the celebration continued. Crowds filled the streets of Paris late into the night, celebrating the extraordinary achievement. Newspapers rushed to print special editions announcing the success of the flight. Across Europe and the United States, people woke up to headlines describing one of the greatest moments in aviation history. The Orteig Prize had finally been won, and the pilot who claimed it was now one of the most famous men in the world. Within hours, messages of congratulations began arriving from leaders in aviation, pioneers across the globe. The achievement represented more than just one successful flight. It proved that long-distance aviation was possible. The Atlantic Ocean was no longer an impossible barrier for aircraft. Air travel between continents suddenly seemed closer to reality than ever before. But for Lindbergh, the attention and fame that followed the flight would be almost as overwhelming as the journey itself. When he eventually returned to the United States, the welcome waiting for him would be even larger than the crowd in Paris. Parades, celebrations, and national recognition would turn the quiet pilot into a symbol of courage and determination. Yet the story of that incredible flight and the 8 minutes that shocked America would leave a lasting impact on aviation history, because after Lindbergh's journey, the world began to believe that the sky was no longer the limit. After the incredible night in Paris, the world could not stop talking about the young aviator who had crossed the Atlantic alone. Within hours, the name Charles Lindbergh was printed in newspapers across Europe and the United States. The quiet pilot who had taken off from Roosevelt Field in New York was now one of the most famous men on Earth. For several days, Lindbergh remained in France, meeting officials, answering reporters, and receiving congratulations from aviation leaders. Everywhere he went, crowds gathered to see him. People were fascinated not only by the success of the flight, but also by the simplicity of the aircraft that had made it possible. The small plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, quickly became a symbol of determination and innovation. Engineers and pilots studied its design carefully, hoping to understand how such a modest aircraft had achieved something so extraordinary. But the greatest celebration was still waiting across the Atlantic. When Lindbergh finally returned to the United States, the reception was unlike anything the country had ever seen for a pilot. As his ship approached the harbor of New York City, thousands of boats gathered in the water to welcome him home. On land, enormous crowds filled the streets. The city organized one of the largest parades in its history. Confetti rained down from skyscrapers as Lindbergh traveled through the streets, waving to cheering crowds. People climbed onto rooftops, hung out of windows, and lined every corner just to catch a glimpse of the man who had crossed the Atlantic alone. For Americans, the achievement represented more than just a flight. It was proof that courage and determination could overcome challenges that once seemed impossible. Soon after, Lindbergh was invited to the White House to meet the President of the United States, Calvin Coolidge. During the ceremony, President Coolidge awarded Lindbergh the Distinguished Flying Cross, one of the nation's highest aviation honors. The young pilot who had once flown mail routes across the country was now recognized as a national hero. But perhaps the most important impact of the flight was not the fame or the celebrations. It was the inspiration it created. Lindbergh's journey changed the way people viewed aviation. Before 1927, long-distance air travel was considered dangerous and impractical. Many believed airplanes would always remain experimental machines used only by pilots and adventurers. The successful transatlantic flight proved otherwise. Suddenly, aviation companies, engineers, and governments around the world began investing more heavily in aircraft development. New airplanes were designed with longer ranges and stronger engines. Airports expanded. Navigation technology improved. Within just a few years, international air travel began growing rapidly. The dream of connecting continents through flight was becoming reality. The Spirit of St. Louis itself was eventually placed in a museum, where it remains today as a reminder of that historic journey. Visitors who stand beside the aircraft often feel a sense of amazement when they realize how small and simple it truly is. It was never the largest airplane. It was never the most powerful. Yet it carried one determined pilot across an entire ocean. And that single flight transformed aviation history forever. Today, millions of passengers travel between continents by air every year. Modern aircraft cross the Atlantic in just a few hours with advanced navigation systems, powerful engines, and large crews. But it all traces back to moments like the one in 1927, when a young aviator dared to attempt the impossible. For more than 33 hours, Charles Lindbergh faced darkness, fatigue, and uncertainty alone in the sky. And when he finally landed in Paris, the celebration that followed lasted only 8 unforgettable minutes. But the impact of that moment would last for generations. Because sometimes, history changes not through armies or battles, but through one person, one idea, and one extraordinary journey across the sky.